today I'm going to be sharing about friction fire. I've dabbled with lots of different things, from cordage making. This was a bow drill set that I made with yucca and the cordage for fire, all natural materials, to friction fire, to just kind of all the other things that we're here learning, little bits of foraging and medicine, just to understand the blessings that we've been given in advance by our Creator. And just it's kind of fun because it gives us an appreciation, but it also not only for what has been given outside and externally in our natural environment, but what has been already given inside in us as we were created in His image. I dabbled with friction fire back in like 2008 or 9, and then went back to work and kind of gave up on that. And then at one of the gatherings, Hal Farneman, I went to a class and did a hand drill for the first time in I think maybe 2017 or 16 or something like that. And then I spent the rest of the year, Claire knows, like every night in the living room, smoking it up and getting coals. And Violet remembers because she would grab my spindles, and she never got a coal, but she would spin them. And so through that play is really where the learning occurred. For those of you that have played with foraging and preserving stuff, that's where the learning occurs. So I'd encourage you to pick something from this experience that you're going to have this week and just play with it. And that's where the growth occurs. So I just spent a lot of time, hundreds of hours, experimenting with every single material I could find in the Northeast Washington, Colville area. And was able to even get a nettle spindle to work with some lashing and support. And then it was actually later, I got too many blisters, and so then I did my first bow drill with friction fire, which is kind of opposite of most people. Since then, I've also been able to do a bamboo fire saw, which is way less useful here and much more physically difficult. So I think with that, I'll jump in. My objectives today is to kind of give you a little bit of background on ingredients of fire, how a friction fire is really generated, the steps in the process, some considerations with speed and pressure, and then we'll demonstrate both of them, and then I can kind of answer any questions or pull with whatever resources I have here, as well as share a couple other useful things, not exactly related to friction fire, but I think useful for you guys to know. All of our house fires every winter, so this was, I think, last winter's fires, was with this hand drill set inside our stove to kind of keep practice. And then I'd like to invite my daughters up here. So Hazel, Violet, and Rose, can you please come up here? So Hazel's a big one, Violet's in the middle, and Rose is the little one. And maybe you guys want to stand in the front there. If you guys want to line up here. And then Hazel, you want to go first? We have 3 ingredients that we need for a fire. And as you guys are aware, triangle's strongest shape. So I have 3 girls here, and they're each going to be an ingredient of fire. So Hazel, would you like to go first? And then once you can guess what ingredient she is, then you can either raise your hand or speak out. Okay? So Hazel's going to go. She's going to try to charade what ingredient she is for fire. Oxygen. Okay. Violet?
Heat.
Okay. Heat. All right. I think I heard it. Fuel. Somebody said fuel. So we need those 3 ingredients. We need oxygen, we need heat, and we need fuel. And that might sound really basic, but it's a tricky dance as we kind of go into this, and kind of that's a foundational understanding. Thank you, Hazel Violet Rose. Good job. So I guess I didn't mention one other thing. I'm actually a wildland firefighter as well. Not my main job, but I do support those activities. And so when you think about heat, fuel, and oxygen, so which one do you think is usually the critical factor in a fire? Whether it's like a wildfire up here or whether it's a campfire? Fuel, oxygen. Okay. Oxygen is usually the critical factor. So if you've noticed on any of the wildfires, if the winds are blowing 50 miles an hour, nobody's stopping that fire. Nobody's managing the fire. I mean, it's doing what it's going to do. And if you notice, usually in a campfire, it's smoky. It's because there's an oxygen issue usually. The reason why we have chimneys in our houses is to create that draw because of the column of like heated air to keep that air moving through. So as you play with fire, whether you guys are having a campfire, think about how is the air moving through there to provide oxygen. And occasionally it's fuel, but usually it's oxygen. When we're putting out wildfires, sometimes they use a retardant to take out the oxygen. So traditionally we used to like suffocate the oxygen by putting sand on the fire. We don't usually do that anymore. And then let's talk about heat. How do we usually put out a fire by taking away the heat?
Make a fire break.
Water.
So when we make a fire break, we're taking away the fuel.
Oh yeah.
Okay. And then what were you saying?
Water.
Water. That's a great one, right? Water has a high specific heat, a lot of thermal energy. We were using it in fomentation earlier because of that characteristic of it to transfer heat. And so if we put water on there, it will cool down the fire and take away the heat. And that is, for me, one of the biggest challenges with friction fire is the moisture, managing your moisture, because it takes away your heat. So the process of doing a fire is a little bit different. Here's my little emergency kit. I have different things, but if I go like this, that was very fast, right? We went instantly to flame. We actually had a flint striker that sparked, and then we provided gas instantly for a flame. We're going to be doing it a little bit differently with friction fire, because what we're going to do is we're going to effectively be kind of like drilling. So in its simplest form, and this is my preferred form, is a hand drill. So I'm using this hand drill, and then we'll have a hearth board, and we would use like a little fire pan, and we're going to grind this to make a black powder that we call char, which that might start to sound familiar. So we're going to have all this black charred powder, and then we're going to heat it up, and then it becomes a charcoal. Exactly. So that's where we get charcoal. Like, it'll actually coalesce. So if we give it like 30 seconds in like the heat, it'll become this little coal that we can then use to stick inside of a little tinder bundle and then give it more oxygen. And by giving it more oxygen, then we get the flame. So there's a few more steps than just, pulling out the lighter and going like this. You just have to kind of nurture it like a kid. Right, Rosie? So we're going to talk a little bit about that process here, and then we can go out and kind of at your preference. I can demonstrate a hand drill, and then we can demonstrate some bow drill. So So usually I'm demonstrating this as I'm going, but there's a lot of dry straw in here. And so it just makes me a little bit uncomfortable because I like Andrew. So um, so I'll talk maybe a little bit about the materials of a hand drill next. So ideal materials are firm, non-resinous. So if they have pitch in them, they are going to be very dense, and they'll they'll polish, and it has a really high ignition point. So once you have a flame, pitch is awesome, but until you have a flame, pitch is not helpful. Unless you're using like a ferrocium rod, which you guys are probably familiar with, like a metal match, which is a very high temperature. So for the things that'll work for a spindle for a hand drill, it is, you're wanting things, the ideal thing is horseweed. It doesn't grow as much up here, I doubt, but like out in the Palouse, it grows. And it's got pretty much like a bunch of brushes on here because it's going to give you a lot of friction. And then an ideal spindle is going to be, for me, between like my pinky nail width and my pinky width. So I use my body parts for all these natural crafts because I don't typically carry a ruler out with me in the field, but I fortunately always have my fingers and my arms. So I know that like a spindle this long is going to be the easiest for me to twirl up a coal. And then I can just kind of check as I'm going out, like, and then depending on the material, I might have to swap ends, etc. So there's a bunch of other things that work. So any of our herbs that shoot up, mullein is one that he had here. We probably won't be able to get the mullein to work today. There's a few nuances. So they were cut, and usually the bottom end of the plant is kind of a little more dense. And so it'll give you a little bit more a surface area of contact. And so for when I'm doing like a hand drill mullein on mullein, then I typically need that. And I haven't been practicing enough to probably make any of these ones work. So these plants that grow up these stalks that have a little bit of pith in the center, so the seasonal plants, mullein, thistles I've used, horseweed, they all work. Additionally, elderberry is like a shrub that works. Things that grow rapidly and have a little center. Do you guys know what I'm talking about when I'm saying center pith? It's that like foamy stuff in the center of a branch to provide a little bit of a spatial structure before it puts on the wood. So usually the first season, anything that grows fast in 1 year has a center foamy pith. And so, a willow, I've used willow, aspen, a bunch of other ones that can send up quick shoots, but that aren't a really hard wood. Like cherry, I've never been successful with cherry. It's a hard wood. But sometimes if you have a mature tree and then it falls over and the water sprouts shoot up, those can be a good, nice straight section that you don't have to heat bend to straighten. Something interesting of note, if you're trying to straighten something, a lot of people will be like this, but you're putting a lot of pressure. So typically you want to bend stuff like this with kind of more support. And then heat bending, but we're not going to talk about that today. So the hearth board, usually you want to be the source of most of your powder. In our area, by far, a Western red cedar, split this direction. Now, it can be done, so for the tree growing, the growth rings are going like this. If you have a board where the growth rings are like this, what will actually happen is between the early wood and the late wood. So early wood, it's. I think I just stopped hearing myself.
Yeah, we stopped hearing you.
I can speak up too, so I'll just continue speaking, and then if it turns on, I'll be quieter. So the growth rings, if you kind of going through the early wood and the late wood, you'll enter layers of softness and layers of hardness. And it's really very difficult to control that with your hands of putting more pressure or not pressure. And as we kind of talk about when we talk about speed versus pressure, you'll end up with glazing occurring. And then you end up making this hardened surface like you're polishing it. And then you don't get any more friction. And then I get blisters. So yeah, any firm non-resinous wood. Another great resource is tree roots. Cottonwood root is amazing because the roots of trees are very spongy. They're much lighter. I don't know if I have actually one in here. I was just going to see if I had any tree roots. I have so much stuff at home, you'd be amazed. I don't have any tree roots here, but they're very light and porous, and so they insulate well. So when you're driving that heat in, so that's a good resource if you're along like the Sauk River or something where it's got wide floodplain and you end up with like the trees washed out with the big cottonwood roots or cedar roots, things like that. So those can be used for the hearthboard. For me, like a hearthboard is usually for a hand drill is going to be kind of that same thickness you guys can see here. So when you're starting from scratch, I already have a hole notched in here, but when you're starting from scratch, you're going to try to make sure your thing is as straight as possible. If it's more than a diameter out of line, it's going to start causing a little more trouble. And then, so we're starting out, usually I will put a point on the end with a knife. So I'm going to do this. Let's see. And then I'll kind of figure out kind of where I want to line this here, leaving just a little bit of gap on the edge. And so this first step is going to be what we call the burn-in. And actually, I might need to do a little bit more because there's center piths. So we'll just kind of gently scoop out a little bit more of a divot. Okay. And let's use the thumb to push. More like 1/8 of an inch. So it doesn't need to be too much. If you're doing a bow drill, you have to set it back a little bit more because you're pushing on the drill sideways. In this case, I'm only pushing down, so it's not going to push it out as much. So that's a good question, Claire. So every time you teach, it's like a different situation. Now I got like, I think I got it. I got to take my ring off though. So any distraction is not helpful. Come on.
How about someone with one arm?
So, not this technique. So when I'm doing this, what I'm trying to do is put some pressure. A lot of times friction will help on your hands. This is kind of for the boys. Is Seth around here? Seth and James? So I would either like spit on my hands or use cottonwood bud. That's a good friction. Dry resin, which I have some there. Honey has been used. So this is kind of a weird, I might actually grab a little bit of, let's see. So what I'm trying to do right now is called a burn-in. You guys probably see a little bit of smoke. I was just kind of preheating it, but I'm trying to get it all set up to the right conditions here. And then we'll, so then we kind of have it burned in here. And then I always save this powder, which we'll see what we want to use for a tinder bundle here. Actually, let me try some mullein. Actually, I should digress. So that was just getting it set up, and then we'll have to cut a notch here. And I left my other bandana. Bandana is super useful. That's why I have one. This is my little emergency kit. So I have a bunch of different things in there. But this is kind of keeping it small so that it can stay in my backpack. So fortunately, it's saving me for this class because what I wanted to show is a tinder bundle, which is kind of one of the big keys to any friction fire is really just kind of prepping. We got interwinnow bark, cottonwood bark. Did I have any cedar? Well, we'll just use one of these. So tinder is what's going to get us, like I said, from like a true tinder would actually take you from a spark, like a flint and steel spark, to a flame. But we're just trying to get it from a coal to a flame. So we want anything that has fine fibers. I have some examples I can pass around here, but I'm going to pull some stuff out. Oh, we got some grass here. It's kind of easier to. I might just burn this.
We got some hay.
Oh yeah, you're right. I do have grass and hay. So kind of doing this like little like ride the bicycle thing is kind of a, which actually I might pull out some of this hay here, depending on how wet it is. You'd be surprised how things are wetter than you think they are. Actually, that's not going to be a great example because those are falling apart. I'm going to use this for the. Yeah, it's definitely wet. I can feel it. We'll just burn it. I just need to go out and collect some more try to maintain some level of stuff for teaching. So what I was showing you is like there's a few different ways you can prepare it, but you're trying to get like nice thin long strands that'll carry. So you don't want to use things that are cut and you wanted to get to this underneath there. So I mean, yeah, I guess it's up to you. If you got some water nearby, we can. I mean, I feel like I'm usually pretty controlled here, but I will want to be able to transport it out to somewhere where I can like flame it. I think we had a tin can right there too.
Too much straw around.
So, so we want to try to make a bird's nest. A lot of times you can break apart the fibers by kind of grabbing a bundle and doing like a little bicycle, especially like with some cedar bark. It was also beaten with like smooth rocks and stuff to kind of separate them out into layers, and then you can kind of work it fine. And I should have probably asked for some of that before. Yeah, you can stick it right there. That's fine. So this is probably getting pretty decent. I can get stuff like this. If I wanted to, I can make a bigger bundle. If it's wet like this and I was collecting stuff to try to really get a fire, I'd have to go a lot bigger, right? Because I have to pre-dry everything as you're kind of working your bundle. And if you go too small with like dry material or wet materials, everything will burn up before you actually can get the flame. So things like willow seed fluff, the small little things like this are really really good. And I'll hand these. You guys can pass these guys around.
Cattail.
I have cattail here too. Yeah, so if Andrew, you want to start passing these guys around, they can wander. These are all good tinders. This one's not labeled. This is clematis. I think white clematis. So if we were going to be using a bandana, and I was actually preparing a lot of the willow stuff. Then you can kind of gather this stuff up and it'll sort itself. in this case, I think I'm going to wait and save some of that stuff for later. But as you kind of gather it up like this, you can kind of pull this, you're pulling the bigger stuff. And then you kind of gather it again, and then it pulls smaller stuff. And then you want to kind of keep it like a little bird's nest. This is a little more difficult because it's not they're not long strands, so it's not holding together. So I'll have to be a lot more careful with it. So normally I would do this, and then we can whenever we generate some powder, then I'll put that inside here because that's, you know, closer to getting ready to go. And then keeping stuff off the ground is like super important because the ground is incredibly wet. You know, anytime you can feel dampness, it's going to be super wet. So where's my spindle? I had this guy right here. Okay, so then we're going to cut the notch. And so I'm going to cut a notch in. So we're going to be, this is to collect the powder, to let it out in an organized fashion. And the notch, you want it to be smooth. If it's rough, it'll topple. And so you'll almost have a coal, and then it'll fall over and go boom. So you kind of want the edges to be smooth. I think when we were out on the beach, I made one with just rocks, and so you kind of have to make it differently. It ends up a lot more like a V shape, but a lot of times these are rectangular. And then we're wanting to have enough space so it kind of gathers some stuff up here, as well as gets the heat. So let's see. And with a hand drill, you can actually go all the way to the center usually, but with a bow drill, you want to leave the notch a little bit further out. So I can even go across. It's because we're not having that side pushing that pushes the spindle out.
So the purpose of the board and the notch is to generate char.
Char, yep. And then to heat that char up. So, and then we have to heat that char up in the presence of oxygen. Because if we don't have enough oxygen, so sometimes we'll try to cut these like little nubs to try to get a little bit of oxygen in. And so then we'll see how it goes, and then we can adjust as needed. But before we do that, I'm going to grab some resin. So I just have some dried pitch here. If you use wet pitch, it'll actually, the sap will stick to your hands and it'll build up on your calluses and kind of make it more of a pain. So then we'll just kind of try to get a little bit on there. Just like rosining a bow, right? So now I'm going to make sure my pan's underneath here. I'll make a coal and then I'm just going to put it out. How does that sound? That's the plan. So I'm going to try to get things warmed up. Breathing is important. This is one activity. So when you start to hear that, like, you don't want to hear squealing. Squealing means it's glazing and it's becoming a polished, dark surface that is not generating heat, and it's going to make more blisters. So right now, I'm just trying to get it preheated a little bit, and then once I'll probably get going a little bit more. So I'm going to try to get a little more smoke than this though before I start trying to generate powder. So we're kind of balancing, right, the speed and the pressure, you know, like a drill bit, right? So right now I should be generating some nice powder. Yep, there's a coal there. I don't know if you can see it.
Yep.
So it's a little bit patience. Can you see that glowing? Okay. So a little bit patience, and then I wouldn't want to move it too fast, so I tell a joke. What did the hearth board, this thing right here, say to the spindle? I got hot, and then I got cold. Wait for it. And that's about the right amount of time for it to bond up. So let's stick this, actually let's just knock it out fully. I could just drop some water on here or some saliva. Do you have water? I'm just paranoid of everything always.
I got a hose here too.
Okay.
What do you want?
Just drip some water in there. There's nothing there, but we can prep it for the next one so it's ready. Yeah. So, so then I would have dropped that in here, and then we would have kind of closed it up and tried to manage the air. I would have done a figure 8. Under most conditions, if it's really like 95% humidity, then I'm just going to blow on it. But otherwise, it's a lot better to give it the air because my breath is moist, right? So it'll actually kind of put a damper on it. The other thing is, if I'm really working these, like if I was actually doing a fire out there on the ground, I got to get it up off the ground. I would usually put my raincoat down first and then my insulation coat, and then I'll start setting up all my stuff on top of it while I'm doing it. Because like I said, the moisture is the big deal. So we have this mullein stalk, and this is the correct time to harvest it. So you don't want a first year green stalk. It's usually this after it's been through and kind of the done flowering at the very end of the year. If you wait one more year, it gets very difficult because it's developed checks or vertical cracks along it, and it's easy for it to blow apart when you're putting that downward pressure. So, so it's kind of like you have to check your material, but it can work. This is not an ideal hearth board. It's very narrow, so it's going to rock on you more. So ideally, you want something that's like 2 inches wide, right? So a couple thumbs wide, and then you have space to kind of run down one side and run down the other. And when you're on it with your foot, it's not going to rock, and you're not going to mess up your coal that you're trying to form. Everybody traditionally would have been, like I guess pre-colonists would have been, had a hearth board and spindle that's dry. You're not going to want to try to make one every time. Like I sometimes do it for fun and for kind of practice and learning, but yeah.
You want to be efficient about starting your fire.
Yeah.
So once you're always on the lookout for stuff that's going to be a good, suitable material.
Exactly, and I don't think I have my down coat with me right here, but yeah, I'm gathering tinder as I go. So I'm walking through the woods. My hat right now is very clean, but you're like, oh, there's a little bit of seed fluff, and then you're kind of like, stick it in your hat and kind of you're letting your body dry those resources. And so as you're going around looking for things and working, you're not going so fast that you're sweating, but you're kind of working around, and then your tinder's, drying throughout your activity of collecting other materials, finding suitable spindles that are straight enough to work, collecting resources. So yeah, that's kind of a continual process, and I have stuff in pockets. Sometimes I'll end up at the office and be like, oh yeah, that's some like cattail fluff in my pocket. And it makes me like calm and be able to focus. And then the other thing I wanted to tie in on that, so tinder is key. Like that can be really, has to be a lot of focus in that. And that will carry over to any type of fire that you make, whether it's with a lighter, whether it's with a ferrocium rod. So like the back of this thing, I can strike. If you can make a good tinder bundle, you can use this thing. If you can't, then this is a lot harder to use. And so this kind of builds your understanding of like that, fire building and kind of starting with very fine and working your way up, like increases in like 5 times the size, 5 times the diameter as you're kind of going up. I saw once like a 20-year-old trying to direct light an 8-inch log, but that doesn't really work well. You kind of got to grow them slow. They would traditionally, you would keep your things going with a coal extender. So this is a tinder conch. It grows on like live birch trees. So this was a commonly used thing, and you can kind of get a coal on it, and then you have to be really sure that you get it out because it'll just punk away for a long time. So using like rotten wood, punky wood, a lot of times they would make like a bundle of like fibrous mat of something, and then wrap it in a bunch of bark, tie it off, and then you kind of close it down to like reduce the oxygen, and you can go maybe like 8 hours traveling with that. I haven't done that just because of usually we're like fire danger, blah blah blah. But that, I mean, if you have a fire going, you want to prepare your char. If you're going to be for another fire, you want to be making sure you're straightening spindles, and you want to be carrying that fire with you if you can. If you got something like this, using something that's going to smolder. So we got this guy right here, and my kids can testify. We've started a fire with this, and it doesn't even have to be like the middle of summer. Obviously right now the sun is super intense, so it's great, but it's pretty much a magnifying glass. So the char is pretty much, this char is you take away the oxygen. So you kind of heat it up. You can put some stuff in there. There's a few different ways you can do it with like tin cans and such, but the easiest way is to just put stuff in here, fine tinder, cloth, jeans, whatever, if you're making char cloth, and then like close it up and then stick it in the fire. It'll off gas and flame for a little while, and then when it stops the flames coming out of the side of it, then you can just pull it out and let it cool. And pretty much that's the easiest way to do it. There's other ways though, but pretty much heating in the absence of oxygen. Every technique for starting a fire is different. Like if I don't use matches for a while, like striking a match like in the wind or in bad conditions, it's challenging, or like using a paper match. And so each of these things has their own conditions that favor them. This friction fire is great when it's breezy. And even like when it's like 10 miles an hour on a ridge line, I can just put the tinder bundle to kind of reduce the wind a little bit. But striking a match in that is very difficult. Getting a lighter to stay lit can be very difficult. So just different tools. I want to hit speed versus pressure. So speed is going to sear and pressure is going to drill. So when I'm kind of driving this thing in, the speed is going to give me a lot more heat. But if I don't have enough pressure, it'll glaze. Okay, it'll become this polished surface that I'll have to stop, chip it out, and so that you guys didn't really hear it, but it'll start to chirp. It'll go, and then like my neighbors, I'm sure, are hearing, and I get nervous. But if you're drilling, if you're putting too much pressure, you're going to drill through it, and your powder is going to be super light colored, right? Just like if you're drilling a hole, like you're drilling a hole in here, you're going to have light powder pop out. So those are kind of the keys things that we're trying to dance with. And then when you understand the concepts, we're trying to get friction, you can adjust, right? I can't bear down enough. I'm not getting enough friction. What am I going to do? I got a little bit of ash, from the fireplace, or I'm going to grab a pinch of sand and just drop it in there so I can get that friction and roughness. I want to talk about bow drill. This is actually probably a little bit more likely for you guys to use, especially this far up here.
Because of the moisture or
because of the moisture. So I prefer hand drill because it's just so simple. Like I have a couple components. They're easy to make. I can make them with rocks, fairly proficiently. When we're starting to talk about a bow drill, it's much more difficult with natural materials. I mean, so usually that's the reason why I carry this, because I have paracord here and then I have a knife to expedite my things. And so if I don't have that, then I'm gonna have to spend a bunch of time making some strong cordage or finding tree roots, which are flexible. And then natural cordage always has to be wet to be flexible. So if it's dry, it's gonna just break up. So that's another thing to be aware of if you end up doing cordage. Cordage is fun to make, by the way.
So when you would use that yucca cord, you would moisten it before you would actually implement it.
Yeah.
So saliva,
Yeah.
water, or
yeah. And there's some other tricks you can do called the Egyptian bow drill, where like if you're doing elderberry, you can actually put a divot and put your cord through it, and in a way that it's actually attached, so you're not having to slip on the bow. And that might make more sense in a minute. Let me get an example of a set, and we'll kind of go through the parts, because we already talked about a hearth board, right? And then we have, this is called a spindle because it spins. And then we have a bow, and some people like curved bows, but honestly, I find it's a lot easier to have a straight bow. And then you can shave it down to get the right amount of flex, but just a straight, that's the easiest component to make, is the straight bow with a little bit of knife technique work. You can get that on there. So we have the cord, the bow, and then we have the handhold or the bearing block. So the way we would do this is do something like this and put it on like that. And then we would kind of wrap our arm around and brace our wrist on our foot. One thing else that I think is really helpful is to take your boots off, whatever, so you're not getting your moisture. But our foots are so amazing that like when you put your foot on there, it just holds it way more stable than even a tennis shoe or anything like that. So it just makes it so much easier. And so then you would kind of go like this, back and forth, and you can hear that. That's kind of the chirping that you usually want to avoid. Sometimes you can overpower it with a bow drill because I'm using these big muscles, right? I've moved up and I'm using these way stronger muscles versus my little hand back and forth. So you can dry out a lot more wood like this. And then the other thing that I thought we would do is I can kind of cut through and make a new hole, and we can make a fire, but we can do a 2-person bow drill. So this is a great one. You can do a 2-person hand drill, but it's a lot more difficult to make it much more effective. But the bow drill is something that 2 people can do. I feel like Andrew, you and somebody else, you guys could be able to figure it out and do it with a reasonable amount of effort. So then when I'm doing this by myself, I try to tip the bow slightly so the cord's not rubbing on itself. And then we're kind of doing the same thing. We're trying to just heat this up. So we're trying to provide the minimum amount of pressure that we need to avoid the chirping, right? Because we don't want to glaze it, but we don't want to wear ourselves out. We got to save our energy. We got to heat this thing up. We got to be patient. And so we want to get everything pre-dried. And that's actually a technique that can be used for green wood as well. Is you can just, if your wood's wet, you just go to it, get a get just barely to a smoke, and then leave it, let it sit for a little bit, dry out, and you kind of just do that over and over until you've kind of dried out your wood.
To be aware of new videos like this one, be sure to subscribe to the Preparing for the Time of Trouble channel. For more free videos and downloadable audio podcasts, as well as handouts, go to www.preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com. Topic categories include recordings of live seminar presentations, country living, sustainable gardening, homestead remedies, how to be self-sufficient when the grid goes down, wild edible and medicinal plants, hydrotherapy, and end-time Bible prophecies. To take advantage of these free resources, go to preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com.